The silence that followed Olivia Carter's words settled over the ballroom more heavily than the soft piano music ever could. Sometimes the biggest mistakes happen because people stop listening to those they believe are beneath them. She had spoken without anger, without defiance, without raising her voice. Yet somehow her calm response lingered longer than the CEO's public reprimand. Daniel Foster studied her expression, expecting embarrassment or regret. Instead, he found steady composure. It unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain. He gave a short nod. "Return to your work." Olivia answered politely, "Yes, sir." She lifted the polished silver tray and quietly continued serving the surrounding tables exactly as she had before the interruption. Her pace never changed. She refilled water glasses before they became empty, replaced folded napkins that had slipped from guests' laps, and thanked each person who smiled in return. She treated the CEO who had just humiliated her with the same professional courtesy she offered everyone else. Mia watched from the service station with disbelief. "How does she stay so calm?" she whispered. Frank, the veteran banquet manager with more than 30 years of hospitality experience, carefully adjusted his tie before answering. "Because she decided a long time ago that another person's opinion would never become the measure of her character." Mia looked toward Olivia again. "I do not think I could do that." Frank smiled gently. "Very few people can." Across the ballroom, Daniel resumed greeting investors and foundation board members, but his attention drifted back toward Olivia more often than he realized. Every few minutes he noticed another quiet act of kindness. She remembered a returning guest's preferred sparkling water. She noticed when an elderly woman struggled to reach her handbag and quietly handed it back without interrupting the conversation at the table. She thanked the kitchen staff each time they carried out another course instead of treating them as though they were invisible. None of those actions appeared rehearsed. They seemed to be part of who she was. Near one corner of the ballroom sat a family who had donated to the Education Foundation for years. Their young son, no older than 9, accidentally dropped his dinner napkin beneath the table while trying to help his grandmother. Olivia gently retrieved it before replacing it with a fresh linen napkin. The boy smiled. "Thank you." Olivia smiled back. "You are very welcome." He hesitated before asking quietly, "Why was that man angry with you?" Several adults at the table immediately looked uncomfortable. Olivia paused only for a moment. Sometimes people carry responsibilities that make them forget to slow down. The boy frowned thoughtfully. "Does that make being mean acceptable?" Olivia gently shook her head. "No, but it reminds us that we can choose to answer impatience with kindness instead of more impatience." The boy's grandmother quietly reached across the table and squeezed Olivia's hand. "Thank you for saying that." Olivia nodded gratefully before continuing her work. Daniel had not heard every word, but he noticed the warmth in the guests' expressions as Olivia walked away. Instead of diminishing her, the public confrontation seemed to have revealed something admirable about her character. That realization irritated him more than he cared to admit. He turned toward his executive assistant. "Who hired Miss Carter?" His assistant checked the digital staff roster on a tablet. "She has been part of the Grand Meridian hospitality team for nearly 6 years. Every performance review has been outstanding." Daniel frowned slightly. "Interesting." Before he could ask another question, the ballroom entrance opened once again. Conversation softened as an elderly gentleman entered with measured steps, supported by a polished wooden cane. His silver hair, warm smile, and quiet confidence immediately drew respectful greetings from guests across the room. Frank walked forward with genuine affection. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore." Charles Whitmore smiled warmly. "Good evening, Frank." His eyes slowly traveled across the ballroom before stopping on Olivia. His expression changed almost instantly. Surprise gave way to recognition, and recognition softened into unmistakable emotion. He watched her for several silent moments as she carefully helped another server arrange dessert plates near the kitchen entrance. Frank noticed immediately. "Do you know Miss Carter?" Charles continued looking toward Olivia before answering quietly. "Know her?" A gentle smile appeared across his face. "Young man, I have been hoping to meet that remarkable young woman again for almost 15 years. Across the ballroom, Daniel overheard the final sentence. For the first time that evening, Certainty gave way to genuine curiosity. The waitress he had dismissed only minutes earlier suddenly seemed connected to a story he knew absolutely nothing about. Charles Whitmore remained standing near the ballroom entrance, his eyes never leaving Olivia Carter, as though he had suddenly found someone he had spent years searching for. Around him, conversations gradually resumed, yet an invisible thread of curiosity spread from table to table. People who had witnessed the CEO's sharp rebuke only moments earlier now found themselves wondering why one of the city's most respected philanthropists seemed deeply moved by an ordinary waitress. Frank smiled politely. "Would you like me to introduce you, Mr. Whitmore?" Charles gently shook his head. "Not yet." His weathered hand rested lightly on the polished wooden cane. "She is working." Frank looked surprised. Charles smiled warmly. No one should be pulled away from doing good work simply because someone important has entered the room. Those words quietly reached Daniel Foster, who happened to be standing only a few feet away. The sentence lingered in his mind longer than he expected. He glanced toward Olivia again. She continued moving gracefully through the ballroom, checking every table with careful attention, making certain no guest felt overlooked. She had not once looked toward him since their exchange. She had simply returned to serving others. Mia quietly approached Olivia near the dessert station. "Are you all right?" she whispered. Olivia placed another porcelain plate onto a silver tray before smiling gently. "I am fine." Mia lowered her voice even further. "Most people would have walked out after what happened." Olivia looked toward the crowded ballroom. "If I allowed someone else's anger to decide my actions, I would no longer be choosing them myself." Mia absorbed the words in silence. "Where did you learn to think like that?" Olivia's smile softened. "My mother used to tell me that dignity is something no one can take unless we hand it away." Before Mia could answer, Frank called for the next course to be served. Olivia immediately lifted another tray and stepped into the ballroom with the same calm confidence she had shown all evening. Charles watched every movement with quiet admiration. Daniel slowly approached him. "Mr. Whitmore." Charles turned with a polite smile. "Daniel, you said you have been hoping to meet Miss Carter again." Charles nodded. "That is correct." Daniel folded his hands in front of him. "May I ask why?" Charles looked toward Olivia before answering. "Because some people leave an impression that time never manages to erase." Daniel frowned slightly. "She worked for you?" Charles gave a gentle laugh. "No." He shook his head. "She helped me when she was just a teenager." Daniel waited patiently. Charles continued. 15 years ago, I was visiting a community learning center on the south side of Chicago. I had been invited to speak with students about scholarships." A faint smile appeared across his face. The presentation ended. Everyone gathered around asking questions. His expression grew thoughtful. Everyone except one young girl. Daniel followed his gaze toward Olivia. "Her." Charles nodded. "She stayed behind because another student had accidentally spilled an entire box of books across the hallway." He smiled quietly. While everyone else hurried to meet successful people, she stayed to help someone who needed her. Daniel remained silent. Charles continued. "I offered to reward her." "Did she accept?" Daniel asked. Charles slowly shook his head. "She thanked me and said something I have never forgotten." He paused. "If kindness only happens when someone is watching, it stops being kindness." Daniel found himself looking toward Olivia again. The words sounded exactly like the woman he had watched serving guests all evening. At that moment Olivia approached carrying fresh coffee. She smiled professionally. "Good evening, gentlemen. May I offer either of you coffee?" Charles looked at her for several seconds before smiling warmly. "I would be honored." Olivia carefully poured his coffee before turning politely toward Daniel. "Would you care for some as well, sir?" Daniel hesitated only briefly. "Yes, thank you." As Olivia poured the second cup, Charles looked at her with unmistakable recognition. "Miss Carter," he said gently, "I do not expect you to remember me." Olivia lifted her eyes. For a heartbeat, she studied his face in thoughtful silence. Then a faint smile appeared. "The man who donated an entire library instead of giving one scholarship." Charles laughed softly, his eyes shining with emotion. "You do remember." Olivia nodded. My mother told me that people who invest in children should never be forgotten. Daniel stood quietly between them, realizing the woman he had dismissed as nothing more than a waitress possessed a history, a character, and a depth he had never bothered to see. Daniel Foster stood silently beside Charles Whitmore, unable to take his eyes off Olivia Carter. Only minutes earlier, he had seen a waitress. Now, with every passing conversation, he was beginning to realize how little he actually knew about the woman standing in front of him. Olivia placed the silver coffee pot back onto her polished serving tray and smiled politely. "Please enjoy your evening, gentlemen." Before she could step away, Charles spoke again. "Miss Carter." She turned with the same calm expression. "Yes, sir." Charles smiled warmly. "Would you spend just a few minutes with me after your shift?" Olivia hesitated only briefly. "If my manager approves, I would be happy to." Charles nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Thank you." Olivia excused herself and continued through the ballroom, greeting another arriving guest with the same kindness she had shown everyone else that evening. Daniel watched her disappear into the crowd before looking back at Charles. "She seems to know you very well." Charles smiled softly. "Not well enough." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Charles rested both hands upon his polished wooden cane before answering. 15 years ago, I believed I was helping young people by funding scholarships." He looked across the ballroom toward Olivia. "That young woman taught me there are moments when simply seeing another person matters, even more than writing a check." Daniel listened quietly. Charles continued. "The community learning center where we first met was struggling to stay open." He smiled faintly. Everyone wanted to thank the donors. Everyone except Olivia. Daniel folded his arms. What was she doing? Charles laughed gently. She noticed the custodian cleaning the hallway alone after the event. Daniel looked surprised. She helped him. Charles nodded. For nearly an hour. He smiled with unmistakable admiration. No cameras. No audience. No expectation of recognition. Daniel remained silent. Charles continued. When I asked why she was doing work someone else had been hired to do, she answered, "Because tonight he should not have to finish alone." Daniel slowly lowered his eyes. The sentence settled heavily inside him. It reminded him of something his own father had once said when he was a boy. Success was measured less by how many people followed you and more by how many people felt respected because you walked beside them. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that lesson. Across the ballroom, Olivia quietly entered the temporary operations room beside the stage. Large presentation screens displayed the evening's fundraising totals, donor commitments, scholarship projections, and financial summaries prepared for the closing ceremony. Volunteers hurried between printers while members of the finance team reviewed final reports before they would appear on the giant screens in front of every guest. Olivia paused only because one page resting near the edge of the conference table caught her attention. A highlighted figure immediately seemed out of place. She looked closer without touching anything. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. The total listed for the National Student Opportunity Fund did not match the percentage allocation shown on the following page. She read the numbers again carefully, then a third time. Quietly, she reached for a nearby calculator resting beside the reports. After only a few seconds, her heart sank. The allocation percentages added correctly, but one decimal point had shifted in the master summary. It looked like a tiny formatting error. Yet if the presentation continued exactly as prepared, millions of dollars pledged by donors would be directed into the wrong education fund before anyone noticed the mistake. Olivia slowly placed the calculator back where she had found it. She immediately stepped away from the table. Her first instinct was not panic. It was caution. Perhaps she had misunderstood the document. Perhaps another version had already corrected the figure. She quietly walked toward one of the junior finance coordinators. "Excuse me," she asked gently. "Has the final presentation already been verified?" The coordinator smiled politely without looking up from his laptop. "Yes. The executive office approved everything about 30 minutes ago." Olivia thanked him and continued walking, but the uneasy feeling remained. She glanced once toward Daniel, who was speaking with several major donors beneath the crystal chandeliers. He had publicly reminded her to stay in her place only minutes earlier. Now she faced a choice that could change the entire evening. She could remain silent and continue serving dinner exactly as she had been instructed. Or she could risk another humiliation by warning the very man who had refused to listen to her in the first place. Olivia Carter remained standing just outside the operations room, her eyes fixed on the financial summary she had already returned to its original place. The figures continued replaying in her mind with remarkable clarity. She had not touched the files. She had not changed a single page. Yet one misplaced decimal point was enough to redirect millions of dollars intended for student scholarships into the wrong charitable account. Once the presentation went live, she drew a slow breath before quietly returning to the service station. "Everything all right?" Frank asked as he arranged another tray of coffee cups. Olivia hesitated. "I hope so." Frank noticed the concern in her expression. "Something happened?" Olivia lowered her voice. "I may have seen an error in one of the financial reports." Frank looked surprised. "The reports for tonight?" Olivia nodded gently. "I cannot be completely certain yet." Frank glanced toward the ballroom where Daniel Foster continued greeting major donors. "You should probably tell someone." Olivia smiled faintly. "I intend to." Frank hesitated. "After what happened earlier." Olivia finished his sentence with quiet honesty. "He may not want to hear it." Frank remained silent. Olivia continued. "That does not change what is right." She lifted another polished silver tray and returned to the ballroom, serving guests exactly as before while carefully considering how to approach the situation without creating unnecessary embarrassment. Across the room, Daniel stood beside several foundation board members discussing the closing presentation that would announce the evening's fundraising total. His executive assistant reviewed the schedule one final time. 10 minutes until the scholarship announcement, she said. Daniel nodded confidently. Everything has been verified. Olivia heard the final sentence as she passed behind them carrying coffee. She paused for only a heartbeat before continuing toward another table. Her mother had often reminded her that certainty was valuable, only when it welcomed verification instead of fearing it. Charles Whitmore quietly watched Olivia from across the ballroom. He noticed the thoughtful expression on her face immediately. When she finished serving the next table, he approached her with gentle concern. "Miss Carter." Olivia smiled politely. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore." Charles lowered his voice. "Something is troubling you." Olivia hesitated. "I may be mistaken." Charles answered calmly. Then finding the truth should never offend anyone. Olivia looked toward the presentation screens being prepared near the stage. "I believe there is an error in tonight's financial allocation." Charles studied her expression carefully. "Are you confident?" Olivia nodded slowly. "Confident enough that remaining silent would trouble my conscience." Charles smiled with quiet admiration. "Then you already know what you need to do." Olivia thanked him with a small nod before walking toward Daniel. Every step felt heavier than the one before. She remembered his sharp words only minutes earlier. "Stay in your place." The sentence still echoed inside her mind, but another voice remained stronger. Her mother's gentle reminder. If the truth protects people, speak it kindly. Daniel had just concluded another conversation when he noticed Olivia approaching. His expression immediately became reserved. "Miss Carter." Olivia stopped a respectful distance away. "Mr. Foster, may I have just 1 minute in private?" Daniel glanced briefly toward the crowded ballroom. "If this concerns service, speak with the banquet manager." Olivia remained calm. "It does not concern service." Daniel folded his arms. "Then what does it concern?" Olivia looked toward the large presentation screen waiting behind the stage. "Your financial presentation." Daniel's expression tightened almost immediately. Several executives standing nearby exchanged puzzled glances. "My financial presentation?" Olivia nodded respectfully. "I believe there may be an allocation error that should be reviewed before the closing announcement." A faint smile appeared on Daniel's face, though there was little warmth behind it. "Miss Carter," he replied evenly. "I have an entire finance department that reviews those reports." Olivia answered without hesitation. "I understand, sir." Daniel continued. "The presentation has already been approved." Olivia met his eyes with quiet sincerity. That does not necessarily mean it is free from mistakes. The surrounding conversation seemed to fade once again. Daniel studied her face, uncertain whether to dismiss her immediately or ask the question that had unexpectedly entered his mind. What exactly do you think you found? Daniel Foster looked at Olivia Carter without saying a word. Around them, executives quietly waited, unsure whether to continue their conversations or excuse themselves. The ballroom remained filled with soft piano music, yet an invisible tension settled over the nearest tables. Olivia spoke with the same calm voice she had used throughout the evening. The allocation summary for the National Student Opportunity Fund appears to contain a misplaced decimal point. Daniel's expression barely changed. You reviewed my financial presentation? Olivia answered honestly. Only one page was visible while I was delivering coffee to the operations room. I noticed something that did not seem consistent with the following report. Daniel folded his arms. Miss Carter, those reports were prepared by certified accountants, reviewed by our finance department, and approved by my executive team. Olivia nodded respectfully. I understand. Daniel continued. Do you have a background in corporate finance? Several executives exchanged quiet smiles, assuming the conversation was about to end. Olivia did not appear offended. I studied finance for 3 years before leaving college. Daniel looked mildly surprised. You studied finance? Olivia nodded. I plan to become a financial analyst. One executive asked with genuine curiosity. What happened? Olivia smiled gently. My mother became seriously ill. Tuition was no longer possible, so I chose to work instead. No bitterness appeared in her voice. She simply stated the truth. Daniel remained unconvinced. Even if that is true, recognizing one number does not mean the report is wrong. Olivia answered quietly. No, sir. That is why I am asking you to verify it yourself. Charles Whitmore had quietly stepped closer without interrupting. He watched both of them carefully but offered no opinion. Olivia continued. If I am mistaken, then nothing is lost except 1 minute. She paused before finishing. If I am correct, that 1 minute may protect the entire purpose of tonight. Daniel glanced toward the large digital countdown displayed beside the stage. 8 minutes remained before the closing presentation would begin. His executive assistant leaned closer. The media representatives are already preparing for the announcement. Daniel looked back at Olivia. Every instinct told him to dismiss the conversation and continue with the schedule exactly as planned. Yet another part of him remembered her words from earlier. Sometimes the biggest mistakes happen because people stop listening to those they believe are beneath them. He took a slow breath. Show me. Olivia did not smile in victory. She simply nodded. Thank you. Together they walked toward the temporary operations room behind the stage. Several executives followed along with Charles Whitmore. Inside, finance coordinators continued preparing final documents. Daniel approached the conference table. Bring up the master allocation summary. One analyst immediately opened the presentation on a large monitor. Olivia stood quietly several feet away. She did not touch the keyboard or move toward the screen. Daniel studied the figures. Where? Olivia pointed respectfully without stepping closer. The total scholarship allocation on page 12 is calculated correctly. The percentage distribution on page 13 is also correct. But the transfer value entered into the master summary appears to use a decimal point one place too far to the right. The room became silent. Daniel leaned toward the screen. One analyst frowned. Another opened a spreadsheet beside the presentation. Fingers moved rapidly across keyboards. Calculators appeared. One by one, the finance team's expressions began to change. Wait, whispered one accountant. Run the source file again. Another analyst compared the original formulas. His eyes widened almost immediately. The transfer amount. He stopped speaking. Daniel looked directly at him. Finish the sentence. The analyst swallowed quietly. The transfer amount is wrong. No one moved. Daniel stared at the monitor while another accountant recalculated every figure independently. 30 seconds later she slowly looked up. She is right. Complete silence filled the operations room. The decimal error would have redirected more than $12 million into the wrong education fund immediately after the presentation concluded. Daniel slowly removed his glasses and looked toward Olivia. For several long seconds he could not find a single word. The woman he had publicly ordered to stay in her place had just protected the reputation of his company, the integrity of the foundation, and the future of thousands of students simply because she cared enough to speak when remaining silent would have been easier. For several long seconds, the operations room remained completely silent. The only sound came from the faint hum of laptop fans and the distant piano music drifting in from the ballroom. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the spreadsheet glowing across the large monitor. The decimal point had been corrected. The formulas recalculated instantly. The final number changed by more than $12 million. Daniel Foster stared at the screen without blinking. His chief financial officer stepped closer and reviewed the calculations a second time. Then a third. Finally, he slowly lowered his reading glasses. "There is no question," he said quietly. "The allocation would have been transferred incorrectly after the presentation." Another accountant nodded. "The formulas themselves are accurate. The error happened when the final summary was entered manually." Daniel looked around the room. "How did we miss this?" No one answered immediately. The finance director finally spoke. "We verified every formula." He paused. "We assumed the summary page had already been verified." Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. Everyone had trusted the previous reviewer. Each person believed someone else had already confirmed the final figure. Olivia Carter remained standing near the doorway, saying nothing. She had not stepped closer to the executives. She had not attempted to explain her reasoning further. She simply waited quietly while the professionals completed their own review. Charles Whitmore watched her with unmistakable admiration. "You noticed the inconsistency from one glance?" he asked gently. Olivia smiled modestly. "The scholarship percentages stayed in my mind because they were unusual." Charles looked curious. "Why unusual?" Olivia answered softly. "My finance professor used to tell us that our eyes naturally remember patterns before numbers. When I saw the transfer value, the pattern no longer matched." One of the senior accountants looked toward her with genuine respect. "That is exactly how we teach junior analysts to catch summary errors." Olivia nodded politely. "It was a very good professor." Daniel slowly turned toward her. "You recognized all of that while delivering coffee?" Olivia answered honestly. "I only noticed something that seemed different." Daniel shook his head almost imperceptibly. "Most people would have ignored it." Olivia looked toward the corrected report on the monitor. "The money belongs to students who are counting on opportunities they may never receive twice." She paused gently. That made it difficult to ignore. Those words settled heavily inside the room. Daniel looked down at the conference table where the printed presentation still rested. Earlier that evening he had told Olivia to stay in her place. Now the very person he believed had no place inside a financial discussion had protected the most important project his company would announce all year. His executive assistant quietly checked the event schedule. 5 minutes until the presentation begins. Daniel nodded slowly without taking his eyes off Olivia. "Update every presentation file immediately." The finance team moved into action. New reports were printed. Digital files synchronized across every presentation computer. One analyst verified the corrections independently, while another confirmed the revised allocation with the foundation's banking representative. The room filled with focused activity. Charles stepped beside Daniel. "She saved you from more than a financial mistake." Daniel looked at him. Charles continued quietly. "She saved your credibility." Daniel knew he was right. If the announcement had proceeded unchanged, journalists, auditors, donors, and board members would eventually have discovered the error. The evening intended to celebrate educational opportunity would have become a story about corporate negligence. Daniel slowly walked toward Olivia. She remained exactly where she had been, waiting respectfully until the executives finished their work. "Miss Carter." She looked up. "Yes, Mr. Foster?" For a moment he searched for words that refused to come easily. Finally he spoke with complete honesty. "I almost dismissed you without listening." Olivia answered gently. "But you did listen." Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. "Only after doubting you first." Olivia smiled kindly. Listening late is still better than never listening at all. Daniel studied her face for several silent seconds. There was no satisfaction in her expression. No pride. No desire to prove herself right. She seemed relieved only because the students who depended upon those scholarships would never know how close they had come to losing part of their future. Daniel suddenly understood that the greatest difference between them had never been education, intelligence, or success. It was that Olivia measured every decision by the people it would help, while he had spent years measuring every decision by the results it would produce. Standing inside the operations room only minutes before the largest presentation of his career, Daniel quietly realized that the biggest mistake Olivia had exposed was not a decimal point on a spreadsheet. It was the way he had spent far too many years overlooking the value of people simply because they wore a different uniform. The corrected presentation files were uploaded with less than 3 minutes remaining before the closing ceremony. Inside the operations room, the tension that had filled every corner only moments earlier slowly gave way to quiet relief. Analysts verified the revised figures one final time, while the foundation's financial officer confirmed the transfer instructions with the banking representative. Every number now aligned perfectly. Daniel Foster remained standing near the conference table, watching the team complete their work. For the first time in many years, he realized how close confidence had come to becoming carelessness. He turned toward Olivia Carter, who still stood respectfully near the doorway, allowing everyone else to finish their responsibilities before saying another word. She had not asked for recognition. She had not reminded anyone that she had been correct. She simply waited until she was certain the students depending on those scholarships would receive exactly what had been promised. Charles Whitmore quietly smiled. "Remarkable," he said. Daniel looked at him. Charles continued. "Most people would have been eager to prove themselves right." Daniel glanced back at Olivia. "She never tried." Charles nodded. "Because she was never trying to win." Those words settled deeply inside Daniel's thoughts. His executive assistant stepped into the room holding a wireless microphone. "The guests are ready. The presentation begins in 2 minutes." Daniel accepted the microphone but made no move toward the ballroom. Instead, he looked once more at the corrected reports resting on the table. "Who entered the summary figure?" he asked calmly. The finance director reviewed the audit log before answering. "It appears the decimal shifted during the final formatting stage." No one noticed because every reviewer focused on the supporting calculations instead of comparing the master summary against the allocation sheet. Daniel slowly nodded. "So this was not one person's mistake." "No," the finance director replied. "It was several small assumptions combined." Daniel looked thoughtfully toward Olivia. "And one careful observation prevented all of them from becoming a public failure." The finance director agreed without hesitation. "Yes, sir." Daniel took a slow breath before walking toward Olivia. "Miss Carter." She met his eyes calmly. "Yes, Mr. Foster?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Earlier this evening I asked you to stay in your place." Olivia remained silent. Daniel continued. "The truth is that you were already standing exactly where you needed to be." Olivia offered a gentle smile. "Everyone was trying to help tonight." Daniel quietly shook his head. Not everyone was willing to listen. Before she could respond, the ballroom doors opened and Frank stepped inside. "Mr. Foster, the guests are waiting." Daniel nodded. "Thank you, Frank." Frank noticed Olivia standing beside the executives and looked briefly confused. Charles smiled warmly. "Everything is exactly as it should be." Frank sensed there was more to the story but respectfully asked nothing further. As everyone prepared to leave the operations room, Daniel paused beside Olivia once more. "Would you walk with us?" Olivia looked surprised. "Sir, I should return to service." Daniel answered gently. "You already served this evening in a way no one else could." Olivia hesitated. "The guests are expecting their coffee." Frank stepped forward with a warm smile. "My team will take care of the final service." He looked at Olivia with quiet pride. "Go." She thanked him softly before joining the small group walking toward the stage entrance. Beyond the curtains, hundreds of guests waited beneath the crystal chandeliers, unaware that the evening had nearly ended in disaster only minutes earlier. They expected to hear another successful fundraising announcement, delivered by a respected chief executive officer. None of them knew that the future of the foundation had been protected by the quiet observation of a waitress carrying a silver serving tray. As Daniel stood just behind the curtain holding the microphone, he looked toward Olivia one final time before stepping onto the stage. He knew he could simply announce the corrected numbers, accept the applause, and allow the evening to end with no one ever discovering how close the foundation had come to failure. Almost no one inside the ballroom would question the success of the event. Yet as he remembered the calm dignity Olivia had shown after being publicly humiliated only an hour earlier, he realized there was one mistake still waiting to be corrected, and this one could not be fixed by changing a number on a spreadsheet. Daniel Foster stepped onto the stage beneath the brilliant crystal chandeliers with the wireless microphone resting quietly in his hand. Hundreds of distinguished guests immediately turned their attention toward him. The giant presentation screen behind him displayed the corrected scholarship figures, while members of the media adjusted their cameras in anticipation of another polished corporate announcement. Olivia Carter remained just beyond the edge of the stage beside Frank and the service staff, prepared to return to work the moment the presentation ended. She expected nothing more than that. Daniel looked across the ballroom before speaking. "Good evening, everyone." Warm applause echoed through the room before slowly fading. He smiled politely, but those who knew him well immediately noticed something different in his expression. The confidence remained, yet it had been replaced by an unusual humility. "Tonight," he began, "we came together to celebrate opportunity." He paused, looking briefly toward the enormous screen behind him. "A few minutes ago, I intended to stand here and present the results of this year's education campaign, exactly as they had been prepared." Another short pause followed. "That almost became the biggest mistake of my professional career." A ripple of quiet surprise moved through the audience. Members of the foundation board exchanged puzzled glances. Journalists lowered their pens only to raise them again moments later. Daniel continued calmly. "Our finance team discovered a critical allocation error moments before this presentation." He deliberately chose his next words. "Actually, that statement is not completely accurate." The ballroom became perfectly silent. Daniel slowly turned toward the side of the stage where Olivia stood beside the service entrance. One person noticed the problem before anyone else did. Every head turned in the same direction. Olivia looked genuinely surprised. Daniel spoke clearly enough for every guest to hear. "Miss Olivia Carter." She remained standing quietly, uncertain whether he expected her to step forward. Frank gave her an encouraging nod. Slowly, she walked toward the stage with the same calm dignity she had carried throughout the evening. Daniel waited until she stood beside him before speaking again. "Earlier tonight, I publicly corrected Miss Carter because I believed she had stepped beyond her responsibilities." He lowered his eyes briefly. "The truth is that I was the one who failed to understand my own responsibilities." Absolute silence filled the ballroom. Daniel continued. "Miss Carter noticed an inconsistency inside our financial presentation that every executive, every reviewer, and I personally failed to recognize." He looked toward the audience. Had she remained silent, millions of dollars intended for student scholarships would have been directed incorrectly. Audible murmurs spread through the room. Several board members looked toward the finance team, who quietly nodded in confirmation. Daniel turned toward Olivia. "When she approached me, I doubted her." His voice remained steady. "Not because she lacked evidence, but because I allowed her uniform to influence my judgment." Olivia gently shook her head as though hoping to lessen his embarrassment, but Daniel continued. "She spoke with professionalism. She spoke with respect. Most importantly, she spoke because protecting students mattered more to her than protecting herself from another public rejection." Charles Whitmore watched from the front row with unmistakable pride. Daniel faced the audience once more. "Leadership is often described as making difficult decisions." He paused thoughtfully. "Tonight I learned that leadership begins much earlier than that. It begins by listening before deciding who deserves to be heard." The ballroom remained silent for one heartbeat longer before a single guest began applauding. Another joined, then another. Within seconds, the entire room rose to its feet. The applause that followed was not loud because people had witnessed a dramatic speech. It was powerful because they had witnessed something far rarer. They had watched a man with every reason to protect his reputation choose instead to protect the truth. Olivia stood quietly beside him, her hands folded gently before her, looking almost uncomfortable with so much attention. Daniel smiled warmly. The scholarships announced tonight will change many young lives. He glanced toward Olivia with sincere gratitude. That future exists because one waitress believed that doing the right thing mattered more than staying silent. The standing ovation continued long after Daniel Foster lowered the microphone. Many guests applauded while others simply watched in thoughtful silence, realizing they had witnessed something far more valuable than a successful fundraising announcement. Olivia Carter quietly stepped back from the center of the stage, hoping to return to her responsibilities before anyone noticed. Recognition had never been the reason she spoke. Protecting the students who depended on those scholarships had been enough. Daniel watched her move toward the service station before speaking once more. Ladies and gentlemen, there is one more announcement I would like to make. The applause gradually faded. Olivia stopped and turned politely. Daniel smiled gently. Tonight has reminded me that excellence is never created by one person. It belongs to every individual who chooses integrity over convenience. He looked toward the banquet staff gathered near the ballroom entrance. That includes every server, every chef, every dishwasher, every housekeeper, every technician, and every employee who helped make this evening possible. The ballroom erupted into another round of applause, this time directed toward people who were rarely recognized in public. Several members of the hospitality staff exchanged surprised smiles. Frank quietly lowered his head, clearly moved by the unexpected acknowledgement. Daniel stepped down from the stage and walked directly toward Olivia. The room became silent once again as hundreds of guests watched the chief executive officer stop only a few feet from the waitress he had publicly embarrassed earlier that evening. He extended his hand. "Miss Carter." Olivia looked at him with the same calm expression. "Yes, Mr. Foster?" Daniel spoke clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I owe you an apology." Olivia remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I judged your position before I understood your character. I assumed your uniform defined the limits of your knowledge. That was my mistake, not yours." Olivia accepted his words with quiet grace. "Thank you for saying that." Daniel slowly shook his head. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to correct it." Charles Whitmore approached with a warm smile. "Real leadership begins when pride no longer prevents honesty." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that now." Charles looked toward Olivia. "And you reminded all of us without raising your voice." Olivia smiled modestly. "My mother believed that people hear kindness longer than anger." Charles laughed softly. "She must have been a remarkable woman." Olivia's eyes reflected gentle warmth. She was. Nearby, members of the foundation board quietly discussed the corrected scholarship report. Several donors approached the finance team, expressing appreciation that the error had been discovered before any funds were distributed. Journalists who had expected another routine corporate speech instead found themselves writing about humility, accountability, and the quiet courage of a woman who refused to ignore a problem simply because no one expected her to understand it. Daniel turned toward his executive assistant. "Beginning tomorrow, I want every department to implement a formal review process that encourages every employee to report concerns without fear of being dismissed because of their position." She nodded immediately. "I will begin drafting the policy tonight." Daniel looked toward Olivia once more. "Good ideas do not belong to job titles." Olivia answered with a gentle smile. "Neither does wisdom." Daniel quietly laughed, perhaps for the first time that entire evening without pressure or calculation behind it. The musicians resumed playing as dessert and coffee were served once more. Guests returned to their conversations, but something inside the ballroom had changed. Executives thanked servers by name. Donors stopped to speak with kitchen employees. Several young volunteers smiled at staff members they had barely noticed before. No announcement instructed them to behave differently. They simply chose to. Daniel stood beside the ballroom windows overlooking the lights of Chicago before glancing back toward Olivia, as she quietly resumed serving coffee exactly as she had at the beginning of the evening. The difference was not in her. She had remained the same from the first moment until the last. The difference was that everyone else had finally learned to see her clearly. The ballroom slowly returned to its gentle rhythm, as conversations resumed beneath the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers. Waiters carried fresh coffee, musicians filled the room with soft piano melodies, and guests gathered in small circles discussing not only the success of the fundraiser, but also the unexpected lesson they had witnessed. Olivia Carter quietly collected empty dessert plates with the same steady professionalism she had shown from the beginning of the evening. Nothing about her pace had changed. Nothing about her smile had changed. Recognition had not altered her character because her character had never depended upon recognition. Frank approached carrying another tray of coffee cups. "You could probably take the rest of the evening off," he said with a smile. Olivia shook her head gently. "Everyone else is still working." Frank laughed softly. "I had a feeling you would say that." Together they continued preparing coffee service for the remaining guests. Across the ballroom, Daniel Foster stood beside several members of the foundation board, reviewing the revised scholarship commitments. One of the directors looked up from the reports. "Daniel, I have attended these events for almost 20 years. He paused thoughtfully. "I cannot remember another evening that taught us more than it raised." Daniel smiled quietly. "Neither can I." Another board member added, "Your decision to acknowledge the mistake publicly earned more trust than hiding it ever could have." Daniel nodded. "That trust belongs to someone else." His eyes drifted toward Olivia as she carefully helped an elderly guest into a chair before placing a fresh cup of coffee beside him. Charles Whitmore noticed the same moment. "She has been doing that all evening," he said warmly. Daniel looked at him. Charles continued, "Helping people before they realize they need help." Daniel remained silent for a moment. "I spent years believing leadership meant having the best answers." Charles smiled. "Tonight you discovered it begins by asking better questions." Daniel quietly reflected on those words. Nearby, several young volunteers approached Olivia. One college student spoke first. "Miss Carter, may I ask you something?" Olivia smiled kindly. "Of course." The student hesitated. "When Mr. Foster spoke to you the way he did earlier, were you angry?" Olivia looked down for a brief moment before answering honestly. "Yes." The students exchanged surprised glances. "You were." Olivia nodded. "Being treated unfairly always hurts." Another volunteer asked softly, "Then why did you still help him?" Olivia looked toward the scholarship banner displayed across the stage. "Because the mistake was never only his." She paused gently. "Thousands of students were depending on those funds. My decision had to be about them, not about my feelings." The students fell silent. One young woman smiled. "I do not think I will forget that." Olivia answered quietly. "I hope you remember something even more important." They listened carefully. Never allow another person's worst moment to decide who you become. Daniel happened to hear those words as he walked past the group. He stopped without interrupting. The sentence settled deeply inside him. Earlier that evening he had believed authority gave him the right to speak without listening. Now he understood that true authority required exactly the opposite. Before leaving the group, Daniel turned toward his executive assistant once more. "I would like to add something to the employee leadership program." She opened her notebook immediately. "What would you like included?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "Every new manager should spend one full day working beside our frontline employees before supervising anyone." She looked surprised. "Every manager?" Daniel nodded. "Every manager." Charles smiled quietly. "That lesson will be worth more than any seminar." Daniel glanced across the ballroom where Olivia was once again carrying a polished silver tray through the crowd. The person who taught it never needed a corner office. The evening gradually settled into a peaceful rhythm, as the final course was served beneath the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers. The urgency that had filled the ballroom only an hour earlier had disappeared, replaced by quiet conversations, grateful smiles, and a sense that everyone present had experienced something far more meaningful than another successful charity event. Olivia Carter carefully arranged empty coffee cups onto a polished silver tray before helping one of the newer servers organize the dessert station. She moved with the same calm focus she had carried throughout the evening. Nothing in her expression suggested she believed she had accomplished anything extraordinary. To her, She had simply done what her conscience required. Daniel Foster noticed that before speaking with anyone else, she quietly thanked the kitchen staff for preparing the evening's meals. She thanked the dishwashers as they rolled another cart toward the service hallway. She thanked the maintenance employee replacing a small light near the ballroom entrance. Every thank you sounded sincere. None of them expected recognition. Charles Whitmore stood beside Daniel with a gentle smile. "Do you see it now?" Daniel nodded slowly. "I thought tonight was about one decision." Charles quietly shook his head. "It never was." Daniel looked toward Olivia again. Charles continued. "Character is rarely revealed during extraordinary moments." He paused thoughtfully. "It is revealed by ordinary moments repeated every single day." Daniel watched as Olivia noticed an elderly guest searching for his walking cane beside the table. Before anyone asked for help, she quietly retrieved it and placed it gently into his hand with a warm smile. The gentleman thanked her before slowly making his way toward the exit. Daniel realized she had been serving people like that all evening long before anyone applauded her name. He turned toward his executive assistant. "Please contact the foundation board next week." She opened her notebook immediately. "What would you like to discuss?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "I want to establish a new scholarship for students who have interrupted their education to care for family members." She looked up with surprise. "That is very specific." Daniel smiled gently. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who quietly postpone their own dreams, so someone else can keep living theirs. Charles looked at him with unmistakable approval. "That sounds like someone finally learned to listen." Daniel smiled. "I had an excellent teacher." A few moments later Daniel walked toward Olivia, who was folding fresh linen napkins beside the service station. She looked up politely. "Good evening, Mr. Foster." Daniel held a small folded card in his hand. "This is not a business offer." Olivia listened quietly. "It is simply an invitation." He handed her the card. "Next month our foundation board will meet to review new scholarship initiatives. I would be honored if you would attend as a guest and share your perspective." Olivia looked surprised. "I am not an executive." Daniel smiled warmly. "Exactly." She looked down at the invitation before answering. "If I come, I would like to speak about students who believe they have been forgotten." Daniel nodded immediately. "Then they deserve to be heard." Olivia accepted the invitation with quiet gratitude. "Thank you." Daniel gently shook his head. "No. Thank you for reminding me that numbers matter because people matter first." Nearby, several guests prepared to leave the ballroom. Many stopped to thank the hospitality staff before walking toward the entrance. Others personally shook hands with chefs, volunteers, and service employees they had barely noticed earlier that evening. No announcement instructed them to do so. They simply carried forward the lesson they had witnessed. As the final guests slowly disappeared into the cool Chicago night, Olivia picked up one last polished silver tray and carried it toward the kitchen without hesitation. Daniel watched her walk away before quietly placing both hands into his pockets. He realized the greatest success of the evening would never appear inside the financial report prepared for the foundation board. The scholarship totals would help thousands of students. But the lesson one quiet waitress had given an entire ballroom would continue changing lives long after every donation had been spent. The final guests slowly made their way toward the grand entrance as the crystal chandeliers dimmed to a softer golden glow, leaving the ballroom wrapped in a quiet warmth that felt completely different from the tension that had filled it only hours earlier. The polished marble floors reflected the last traces of candlelight while members of the hospitality staff folded white linen tablecloths, gathered fresh flowers, and carefully prepared the room for another ordinary day. Olivia Carter carried a small stack of neatly polished coffee cups toward the kitchen before returning to help Mia organize the final serving trays. She worked with the same peaceful focus she had shown from the beginning of the evening. Nothing about her posture suggested she believed she had changed anyone's life. She simply believed every task deserved the same care whether someone noticed or not. Frank smiled as he watched her straighten the last row of silverware. "You know," he said quietly, "most people will remember tonight because of what happened on that stage." Olivia gently adjusted another folded napkin before answering. "I hope they remember the students instead." Frank laughed softly. That sounds exactly like you. Nearby, Daniel Foster stood beside the ballroom windows overlooking the lights of downtown Chicago. He watched employees finish their work with a level of attention he had never given those quiet moments before. For years he had entered grand events focused on schedules, speeches, financial reports, and public expectations. Tonight he found himself watching a dishwasher thank a chef for staying late, a server helping another employee carry heavy trays, and a maintenance worker receiving a sincere handshake from one of the foundation directors. The atmosphere had changed without anyone announcing that it should. Charles Whitmore slowly walked beside him. "You are looking at something different now." Daniel nodded. "No." He smiled thoughtfully. "I am finally looking at what was always there." Charles rested both hands upon his polished wooden cane. That is how real change usually begins. Daniel looked across the ballroom toward Olivia. "Earlier tonight I believed the greatest mistake was a decimal point." Charles followed his gaze. "And now?" Daniel answered quietly. "The greatest mistake was believing someone's value could be measured by the job they were doing." Charles smiled with quiet satisfaction. "That lesson will serve you far longer than any business success." A few moments later Olivia finished placing the final serving tray onto its shelf before removing her neatly folded white apron. She thanked every member of the kitchen staff individually, wished the security team a peaceful evening, and picked up her small shoulder bag. As she walked toward the employee exit, Daniel met her near the hallway. "Miss Carter." She smiled warmly. "Good evening, Mr. Foster." Daniel held out his hand once more. "I wanted to thank you before you left." Olivia accepted the handshake. "You already did." Daniel gently shook his head. "Not completely." He paused before continuing. "Tonight you protected our foundation, our students, and my company. But you also reminded me of the kind of leader I intended to become many years ago." Olivia listened quietly. "I am glad you remembered." Daniel smiled. "So am I." For a brief moment neither of them spoke. No photographer stood nearby. No audience remained to applaud. Only the quiet sounds of employees finishing another shift echoed through the nearly empty ballroom. Olivia adjusted the strap of her bag before wishing him a pleasant evening. Then she disappeared through the employee entrance exactly as she had done after countless ordinary workdays. Daniel remained standing in the hallway long after the door closed. He realized the woman walking into the cool Chicago night had not needed wealth, authority, or recognition to change the course of the evening. She had simply refused to let another person's unfair judgment become an excuse to abandon kindness or truth. Behind him, the final lights inside the ballroom slowly faded one by one until only a gentle glow remained above the empty tables. Tomorrow another event would fill the room with new conversations, new guests, and new expectations. The flowers would be replaced. The silver would shine again. The schedules would begin all over. But the people who had gathered there that evening would carry home something far more lasting than memories of a successful fundraiser. They would remember that the strongest voice in the room had belonged not to the person holding the microphone, but to the person who quietly chose integrity when silence would have been easier, proving that genuine greatness is never found in status alone, but in the courage to see the worth of every human being before making a judgment.